All right. The Megillah and anti-Semitic tropes. Does the Megillah provide insight on modern anti-Semitism? And that is our subject today. So, when we start with anti-Semitism, it's an interesting question. You can start with the question of what exactly do anti-Semites hate? What is it about the Jew that troubles the anti-Semite? And I have a completely random collection of anti-Semites here. On the left of your screen is Karl Marx, who wrote a whole book about the problem of Jews. Famous anti-Semite Henry Ford next to his invention, and a modern anti-Semite, Mel Gibson, who may fall into the category of Christian anti-Semitism. But really, the question a little bit is, what is this all about? And 3 years ago, there's a woman who graduated from my alma mater, from Columbia University. She also was, for a time, a a columnist for the. Hold on one second. Let me just throw over you. Let me put the mutes on. Here we go. Okay. There's a woman who for a time was part of the New York Times editorial board. She left the New York Times because she felt they were actually not very open-minded. Different subject, not our subject tonight. But she wrote this book, very good book, called How to Fight Anti-Semitism. It's a short little book. It's relatively light, but she wrote the book because she realized something very interesting. That on the same year that you have, the Charlottesville March, the Jews will not replace us, you also have anti-Semitism of an entirely different variety, which is the anti-Semitism of the left, the desire to make Israel a pariah in the world. In university campuses, the only people that you're allowed to hate anymore are Jews, and so this is, she said, how is there's anti-Semitism on the right and the left? Usually right and left don't agree on who to hate. And why is this so? So she writes, there's a direct quote from her book. The first problem in understanding anti-Semitism is that this particular enemy is not a person or even a set of people. It's not even a solid idea or a singular theory. And Weiss continues, she says, the second problem is that it's unclear what this protean worldview actually opposes. Sometimes it seems bent on eliminating a religion. At other times it seeks to erase a culture or a particular group of people. And so she is saying that, it's really hard to define what anti-Semitism is. And she goes on to say that part of the reason that it's difficult to define that is because it is difficult to define the Jew, right? What does it mean to be Jewish, right? How many times have you, been to some Jewish exercise where they say, who is a Jew? What is a Jew? And it's a very interesting problem as it meets the Megillah, because the Megillah is the first time that we have a story in the Bible. Let me just qualify that actually. After the Jews come into the land of Israel, after the land of Israel is set up, after Jerusalem is our capital, after this point, it is the only story in the Bible that deals with the entirety of the story taking place outside of the land of Israel. So it's a nation without a homeland. And it is a story where all of the characters have Persian names. If you've attended some of my lectures before, you know that Mordechai is Marduk, the Egyptian god, the Babylonian god of war, and Esther is Ishtar, which is a goddess of fertility. And so all of the Jewish characters have Persian names, and it is the first story that is oriented in the Persian calendar. The month of Adar is a month in the Persian calendar. In the Hebrew calendar, we name them by the numbers, and it is also an interesting thing, because if this Jewish thing is a nationality, if you're members of a nation, how is it that Mordechai and Esther both hold high positions in a Persian court, right? If they're Jews. And so what are these Jews? Are they a nation? Are they a religion? Are they an ethnicity? How do you define them? So the very problem with anti-Semitism is that anti-Semitism doesn't know what the Jew is, because the Jew has trouble defining himself. If we had never been exiled from the land of Israel, this would not be an issue. We would all live in Israel. We would be Israelis. We would have the Israeli nation, the Israeli religion, the Israeli language, the Israeli everything. But, in fact, we are a very unique group of people, because we are a group of people with a national identity, an ethnic identity, a cultural identity, a religious identity that transcends borders, where a Jew from, let's just take the medieval context, a Jew from Italy may have more in common with a Jew from Metz in France than he has with his neighbor next door to him, right? And so this is a very sort of unique kind of a thing. Who are these people? Now, this special character of the fact that we are a people within a people, we are a group within a group, we defy a particular definition, brought great troubles to the Jews throughout the centuries. And one of the things to look at is, I'm calling it the original sin of the Jew. This isn't a technical term. This is just kind of what I'm using as a working title. But the idea is that there's something other about the Jew, and the Jew needs to be kind of, we as a people, we struggled with this mightily, as I'm going to show you in the next couple slides. But here's just a caricature of the Jew. This image is taken from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, or it's collected there, and it's a caricature of an anti-Semitic Viennese magazine. And I just want to show you a couple of the stereotypes that are going to prevail here. First of all, the greed is a motivating, or is a common trope that is attached to the Jews. So that sort of screams off at the beginning. If you're not really sure what this particular Jew is doing, so he is cutting off a piece of the coin. So coins were minted by the particular rulers, and you could take off a little bit of the coin and it would still hold its face value. But then you could melt out the other parts, and when you melted out the other parts, you could then have some other value. But you're cheating the person who gets that coin, because someone could challenge that coin and say, well, this isn't really a full coin. And so this is sort of the Jew as greedy and cheating. That's number one. One of the other things which is mentioned is, the text reads, clipping for circumcision. So this is sort of suggesting, the Jews, they are physically other, right? There's some difference about them in being physically other. And last but not least is this very profound physical difference between what a Jew would look like and what I guess a Viennese would look like. And this otherness is very important. The reason the otherness is very important is because one of the operating theories behind the Jewish fighting anti-Semitism in the 19th century was that maybe if we Jews can just be cultured enough, maybe if we could just be German enough, maybe if we could just be Viennese enough, we could erase this friction we have with the non-Jews. And so there's Yale has a professor of Jewish history. He's written a lot about anti-Semitism, David Sorkin. And David Sorkin writes the following. He says, the tutelary state, this is the state, meaning the state as an educational institution. What's the state trying to do? It's trying to educate its Jews, make them into something usable. Was to educate Jews to become worthy of citizenship. The bargain that they made with Jews is, if you guys become German enough, if you become cultured enough, then you earn the right of being a citizen. And then what does this translate to? In their own public sphere of sermons, journals, and associations, Jewish leaders, especially preachers and rabbis, endlessly reinterpreted this ideology of emancipation, consisting of the quid pro quo of rights for regeneration. Regeneration means recasting yourself in the mold of Germans, which included occupations, religious reform, and the acquisition of German language and culture. Meaning, we took this on, right? Our own leadership said, oh, you know what? We're going to wash the anti-Semitic part of our Jewishness out of us. We're going to try and keep the essence of Judaism, but we're going to try and make ourselves a little bit more appealing, more German, more cultured, more refined. A very good example of this is in the construction of synagogues. If you look at Emancipation era synagogues, you will find that they have moved the bima to the front of the shul. Classic synagogue architecture has the bima in the center of the shul, based on a verse, Mimamakim kraticha, from the depths we called out to you, God. But if you look at some modern synagogues, some of the high German Reform synagogues into Hungary as well, they would put the bima into the front of the shul. And there was a huge fight about this. There was the Chatam Sofer, Rabbi Moses Schreiber said, you can't walk into such a shul because they are throwing out the traditions of the Jewish people. The motivation to put the bima at the front of the shul is because, of course, in the church, the altar is in the front of the shul. So Jews were trying to say, well, this isn't really, it's not like getting rid of the Ten Commandments. It's not like we're taking off our talis, right? We're just moving things to the front. The Reform movement took this much further, right? They wanted to put Shabbos onto Sunday. There are all sorts of things, but there are all sorts of minor things. Just another example of how this played out. In Hungary, some of the rabbis were very opposed to what they called chorshulen. Chorshulen are synagogues that had choirs, because the choirs were meant to mimic the way in which Germans worshipped, so it would feel more menschlich, more refined, more cultured. And what's wrong? It's good music. It's part of the celebration of Torah. But again, these are things which are cultural issues where the Jews are trying to earn their right to be citizens. Now, this is always problematic when you have to redefine yourself to be accepted by the anti-Semites. Just to show you how far this goes, this is a piece that was appreciated on both sides of the spectrum. This is how Jews thought that they could earn their place in Europe, and this is also how the anti-Semites kept the Jews apart. This is the Volkischer, is the People's Observer. This is a German Nazi Party publication, and it said things like, "No German buys from the Jew, and there are Germans and Jews in our country. Everything separates Germans and Jews." And to show you another very interesting example, Victor Klemperer, who wrote the language of the Third Reich. So he himself was Jewish, and he converts to Protestantism, and he is obviously still on Hitler's list. But what he's telling you is anything and everything in the language of the Third Reich relating to the Jew is geared to segregating them as completely and irreconcilably as possible from everything German. It's oil and water. You can't fix the problem. The Jew is separate. There is no integration of the Jew. And part of this is the interesting piece of being poorly able to define what the Jew is. The Jew is the perpetual fifth column. And now what I want to do is look at that lens of anti-Semitism. The lens of anti-Semitism as the Jew as perennially other, as something different that can't be integrated into your society. And I want to look at how the Megillah looks at that issue. And so here, the first thing we're going to do, the first pass on the subject, is going to be in the Megillah's own words. And here, this is from the third chapter of the Megillah. It says as follows. Sometime after King Achashverosh promoted Haman, son of Hamdata, the Agagite. He advanced him and seated him higher than any of his other officials. Okay, nothing terribly anti-Semitic there. What are we seeing? We're just seeing that Haman is a high official. He's been promoted, but in internal Persian terms, he's the vizier. He's the second in command of Achashverosh. Now, second pasuk. All the king's courtiers in the palace gate knelt and bowed low to Haman, for such was the king's order concerning him. But Mordechai would not kneel or bow low. Now here's the interesting thing about Mordechai, right? Mordechai cannot submit to a power. This is, in a way, the classic trope, right? The classic trope is Jews are not real Germans, right? Jews are fifth column. Jews cannot be integrated. We're going to see, by the way, how this also happens on a religious level, but right now let's just leave it at the political level. At the political level, Mordechai is not going to submit to this new custom, to this new kind of authority. Mordechai is going to stand out as other, as different from, in the political sense, from all the other ministers. And then, in case you missed it, the Megillah says, then the king's courtiers who were in the palace gate said to Mordechai, why do you disobey the king's order? Right? Again, this is the rules. What's with you Jews? Why can't you Jews follow the orders? When they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them. Again, Mordechai he answers an authority which is higher than the king, right? He has a politics that are beyond those of Achashverosh, right? And that is a part of the great challenge of the Jews. You know, just to give you another example of how this plays out in the history of Jews in Europe, Napoleon convened a Sanhedrin, a high religious court, to declare that the Jews were no longer a nation, only a religion. Right? He put 71 rabbis together to make this declaration around this idea, because again, there is this position that Jews do not fall in line. They are irreconcilable with civil society, with political society. When Mordechai would not kneel, bow low to him, Haman was filled with rage. So Haman is very anguished about this, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordechai alone. Having been told who Mordechai's people were, Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews, Mordechai's people, throughout the kingdom of Achashverosh. So, interesting response, right? The leader of the Jews is displaying, maybe it's civil disobedience, maybe it's his own independent streak, maybe he thinks there could be a variety of reasons why he's not bowing down to Haman. But what's the response? The response is a non-complimentary response, right? Okay, if Mordechai is chaining himself to the gates of the palace, if Mordechai is boycotting the buses, throw Mordechai in jail, right? That's what you do to people who are disobeying. But here, the response to Mordechai's disobedience is sort of a classic anti-Semite response, because now we are eradicating not just Mordechai's behavior, we have to eradicate Mordechai's people, right? There is something in this insidious cabal of the Jews that is impossible to get rid of, unless we get rid of the whole picture. Okay, now, the next pasuk 7, I just put in there so I wouldn't break the continuity of the narrative, but it tells us that in the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Achashverosh, they took a lot, right? They took a pur. A pur is a lot. Purim means lots. It was cast before Haman concerning every day and every month until it fell on the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. And the what I think is very interesting about that is the lottery again reinforces this idea that there's no rhyme or reason to this action. This action is fully disproportionate, right? it reflects a paranoia about the power of the Jew, because the Jew can't be defined. And so if the Jew can't be defined, well, we have to get rid of all of them because we don't know how to contain them. And here we go. We have to take lots because this is all random. Now, here is sort of the Jew that lurks behind the scenes. And Haman then said to Achashverosh, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed amongst the other peoples. This is mifuzar umifurad bein ha'amim. So not only do we have this Mordechai problem, but this Mordechai problem infects everywhere, right? I don't know how deep this is. Achashverosh had 127 nations from India to Ethiopia, and the Jews are scattered all over there. I can't get rid of this problem unless you let me uproot it, root and branch. And so these people are dispersed amongst all the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, who do not obey the king's laws. Who said they don't obey the king's laws? One guy doesn't bow down, all of a sudden. Again, we're back to this idea of Jews cannot be put into the box. They obey a different authority. And so the anti-Semitism here is this fear that Jews obey a different authority, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws, and it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. Now, this is a fascinating, when you read, I'm gonna go back and forth between this and Barry Weiss's words. She says, anti-Semitism successfully turns Jews into the symbol of whatever a given civilization defines as its most sinister and threatening qualities. Meaning, it doesn't have to be true about the Jews. We are this blank canvas, this Rorschach test, that you can project your most insecure qualities onto. And this is a fascinating list. She says, under communism, the Jews were capitalists. Under Nazism, the Jews were race contaminators. Today, the greatest sins are racism and colonialism. Israel, the Jew among the nations, is being demonized as the last bastion of white, racist colonialism. Right? If you go to college campuses, the reason that it is permitted to hate the Jew, the reason it is permitted to throw shade, the reason that someone doesn't get expelled from Megillah University when he writes punch a Zionist, is because really punch a Zionist means punch a colonialist. Well, everybody knows colonialism is horrible, and everybody knows that racism is horrible, so you might as well have said punch a racist. But you can just throw this onto the Jew and it sticks. Because there's this sort of theory, we work in the background. We are behind the scenes. And let's go back to this same sentence, this same verse. There is a certain people scattered and dispersed amongst the other peoples in all your provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of other people and who do not obey the king's laws. What is Achashverosh most worried about? When you govern 127 provinces from Ethiopia to India, you're afraid that the kingdom's going to break apart. That's what you're afraid of. And so this plays right into exactly what Barry Weiss says. Jews become the embodiment of whatever the prevailing society sees as its greatest threat. Continuing now to the next verse in the Megillah. Accordingly, written instructions were dispatched by courtiers to all of the king's provinces to destroy, massacre, and exterminate all the Jews, young and old, children and women, on a single day. Right? Genocide is born here. The answer to Mordechai not bowing down, just so we're really clear on what's going on here. The answer to Mordechai not bowing down is to destroy, massacre, exterminate all the Jews, young and old, children and women, on a single day. On the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. That is the response. And you can see that this idea, this sort of paranoia about a culture's worst fears being thrown onto the Jew, because we Jews, we sit in both the, they call it the Seinfeld effect. We're very good at blending into the culture, right? Moses Mendelssohn was accepted into the intelligentsia of his day, right? Bob Dylan is really Bob Greenberg. The Jews have Steven Spielberg is one of the most successful movie makers of all time. Mark Zuckerberg and Michael Bloomberg are household names because they are amongst the wealthiest and most successful, and Howard Schultz, most successful people in the economy today. If you look at the leadership of the United States of America, you have the Secretary of State is Jewish, the Secretary of the Treasury is Jewish, the Attorney General is Jewish, the Senate Majority Leader is Jewish. Right? We exist in all of these places, but yet there is this piece of us which is Jewish. Do we belong to Israel? Do we belong to a religion? How much influence does our rabbi have over us? I can tell you from the other side of the aisle, not that much, but the question of how much are people manipulated by some other allegiance it's a powerful thing. And Mordechai and Esther sit in powerful places, and this idea takes hold to the extent where we're ready to turn it into genocide, because this is a problem we cannot tolerate. Just want to show you just a couple of other interesting pieces of the Megillah as they are expressed in art. These are actually fundamental themes in the Megillah, but this is just sort of an artist's rendition of those. A little bit of a multi-sensory approach here. One of them is that Mordechai wears different kinds of clothing. This is a theme in the Megillah, right? Again, this otherness of the Jew is emphasized in the text itself. Mordechai comes to the king's gate. You'll see this is the picture on your right. Paul, Alexander, Alfred, Leroy, right? Haman and Mordechai. So this is Mordechai sitting in sackcloth outside the king's gate. You can see he's dressed very differently than everyone else. Everyone else is bowing down to Haman. Mordechai is he's indifferent to Haman, and you see that he's also wearing sackcloth. This, by the way, we're going to see is, you'll notice, this is Mordechai wearing the clothes of the king on the left. The Triumph of Mordechai, Peter Lastman, 1624. And here you see Mordechai in all the grand clothes of the king. Just one more rendition of the same before I drop the hammer here. And this is Rembrandt's version of it. Now, Rembrandt's version of it is very interesting because Achashverosh in the background on your right is mostly in the shadow with his face in the light. Haman is, again, his despondency is in the light, but the darkness is sort of taking over his his headpiece. Mordechai is again, he's in sackcloth. He's in simple clothes. Now here's where this is a very, very interesting piece of the puzzle. And that is that when we learn about this, so after Mordechai is paraded around in these really splendid clothes, right? He's dressed up in the king's clothing. He walks around on the king's horse. So the Megillah tells us that after that happens, after Haman is forced to lead Mordechai around in an act of shame, Mordechai, you might think, well, maybe, I got the king's clothes on. Maybe I should just stay in these, maybe I can get a lot of power out of that. So if you look at verse 12, it says, then Mordechai returned to the king's gate while Haman hurried home, his head covered in mourning. So Rashi says that Mordechai's place was at the gate. He returned to sitting at the king's gate in sackcloth. So Rashi tells us that the picture of Mordechai could well be this picture of Mordechai on the right. This is where Mordechai sat. It's where he always sat. That's how he always dressed when he sat there. So when it said Mordechai returned to the gate, of course he returned to the gate wearing the same things he always did. In other words, you can even put the king's clothes on Mordechai. You can even dress up the Jew like a German artillery officer. But in the end, look who the Jew really is inside. he is someone who is different, holds his faith. And this is Haman. Haman is just completely seething, and they remind him that he has a set of gallows for Mordechai. Okay. Now let's take let's take a look at what the rabbis tell us about the Megillah. So the rabbis see this otherness in a slightly different kind of set of terms. The rabbis are interested about the cultural issues. In other words, the very things that German Jewry tried to massage in order to make the Jews fit in, the rabbis saw as a dangerous slope that they were very wary of. So it's very interesting, by the way, that the rabbis say that the reason that the Jews, actually, let me just take a step back before I get there. There's a real problem in the Megillah. The real problem in the Megillah, just like Barry Weiss says, right, is that the enemy is not a particular person or even a set of people. It's not even a solid idea or singular theory. For what sin does all this tsaros come upon the Jews in the Megillah? There's no theological sin presented in the words of the Megillah that even comes close. The Jews in the Megillah are very pious, right? There's not a sin there. The rabbis will fill in the sin, and that's why I have a whole section on the rabbis, that they're filling in that sin. But again, the sin, the only reason that we can discern in the Megillah for why this tsaros is coming on the Jews is because of one man's fashion choice and body position, right? Mordechai doesn't bow down, and he wears different clothes. That's it. There's no sin. The rabbis are not going to be satisfied with that. The rabbis are going to say, we need to figure out what, theologically, spiritually, what did they do? So one theory for that is they ate the cuisine of the non-Jews. Achashverosh had this big party, and everybody knows you're not supposed to eat non-kosher food. And one of the reasons you're not supposed to eat non-kosher food is because it prevents assimilation. So what was the sin? They went to the party, they ate non-kosher food. So that is one part of that theory. So here, a second theory comes about. This one is about the sin of idolatry. Mordechai would say to someone, "Why are you violating the king's command?" Rabbi Levi said, Mordechai would say, "Moses our Mashon cautioned us in the Torah. Cursed is the man who will craft an idol or cast a figure. And this wicked one is rendering himself as an idol. And Isaiah the prophet cautioned us, desist from the man who has breath in his nostrils, as what is he considered?" In other words, don't bow down to a person who's acting like an idol. "Moreover, I am of the nobility of the Holy One, blessed be he. All the other tribes were born outside of the land of Israel, and my ancestor was born in the land of Israel." They said to him, "We will tell him immediately." And they told Haman. So there are two interesting things in this text. I'm going to pull out each one separately. The one which is much more minor is that Mordechai, we're told, is a Benjaminite. And Benjamin is only one of the 12 tribes born in Israel. In other words, Mordechai is exactly as he is charged. He is loyal to Israel. He's more loyal to Israel than all these other people. And so his loyalty to Israel is the source of the anti-Semitism. I thought that was cute. I couldn't resist it, but that's a side point. Let's get back on track. Mordechai says, this man is casting his politics in a religious terms. And in religious terms, Mordechai is saying, you guys have to remember, you live by a different set of religious rules. So there is an interesting theory in anti-Semitism about this whole idea of other gods. And it sort of starts with this interesting anti-Semitic moment that Mantheo in the year 300 BCE articulates about the Jews, because there's a powerful and growing Jewish community in Alexandria in Egypt. So this is maybe a couple hundred years after the Megillah. And he accuses them of being diseased. And the idea here is that the Jews were not liberated from Egypt, they were expelled from Egypt. They were expelled because they were diseased, they were lepers, and so the king of Egypt threw them threw them out. They were never liberated. And David Nyberg, who writes a book about anti-Semitism, writes the following. He says, the Egyptians were offended not only by the sacrifice, but also by the very nature of the Passover festival, as a reenactment of the Exodus from Egypt. What was for the Jew a commemoration of liberation and the victory of monotheism over idolatry, was for the Egyptian an offensive celebration of the destruction of Egypt and the defeat of their gods. The fact that we do not embrace the religion of the host country is itself a version of betrayal. It is a version of treason. And I will, this is some very deep religious and classic anti-Semitism, but it has, I think, there is a political religious overlay here, right? And so this idea that Mordechai saw Haman was wearing an idol, he thought of himself as a god, he wouldn't participate in their religion. This is part of the whole anti-Semitism. This is the fifth column idea of anti-Semitism. And so the idea that the Jews didn't adopt Christ, his blood is on us and on our children. That's the gospel according to Matthew, right? This is Gibson's, Mel Gibson's, what's it called? The Passion of the Christ, where he says this line out loud in Aramaic in the movie. He does not edit it out, right? That is Gibson makes that a statement in the movie in the 21st century. But on your left is something perhaps much broader than even you know. These are two statues. On the left is Ecclesiasta, the church, and on the right is Synagoga. And I don't know if you can see, but should notice that Synagoga is blind. She can't see the truth of the church. Her staff is broken, and over here in her hands are the 10 Commandments, about to slip out of her hands. But I want you to focus on the blindness. The idea here is the Jew is mistakenly clinging on to something that any full-sighted person could see. That the God has rejected the Jews. So this is if you will, the religious version of the same. In other words, the Jews are a fifth column, and their religion proves it. And so when the rabbis say that the sin was that everybody else was bowing down to the idol, then this is exactly the challenge. The challenge is that these Jews are pretending to be of the right nation. Now, let me just. Sorry. Maybe I'm wondering where that slide went. Wait, maybe this is it. Here it is. Interesting thing is, Mordechai, I apologize that for some reason the text isn't working out proper. Oh, here. Here we go. So they said to Mordechai, but if it's true that they worshipped idols and therefore deserve to be destroyed, why was a miracle performed on their behalf? Is there favoritism expressed by God here? So he said to them, they didn't really worship the idol, but they pretended to do so only for appearance, acting as if they were carrying out the king's command to bow down before the idol. So too, the Holy One, blessed he, did not destroy them, but did act angry with them only for appearance. He too merely pretended to desire to destroy them. all he did was issue a threat, but in the end, the decree was annulled. What's fascinating here to me is how well the Megillah predicts the rabbi's discussion of how the dynamic between Haman and Mordechai. Mordechai was a purist, said, you know what, I'm Jewish, I don't bow down to the idols. Lots of the other Jews said, what's the big deal? We'll bow down, we'll pretend just like everybody else, and this too will pass. This happens, give it another 1600 years, and you're square in the middle of the Spanish Inquisition, where the Jews said, okay, we'll pretend. And then there was a whole, essentially torture regime that was bent on discovering who was really pretending. So you have a very different outcome where this otherness, again, can't really be washed away. It can't be pretended away. You can't get rid of this sense of being different. Just because the hour is running a little bit late, I won't go too deep into this, but just to give you one other version of this. So this is Esther Rabbah, and so in this particular text, the sin that the rabbis suggest happens is that at the party of Achashverosh they had prostitutes, and that was the problem. And I think this is very interesting because, now you have all the real cultural challenges: eating non-kosher food and fraternizing with non-Jews, the religious pretending to adopt their gods, and then worst of all, right, is when you get into bed with them, literally, then your ability to preserve Jewishness is erased. Now, lest you think I'm going to end tonight without any good news, I have some good news for us. And that is that the Megillah actually also comes up with a solution to this. Now, one of the things I would like to just point out about the Megillah is that the Megillah has an interesting plot line. You have a king who writes laws that mean nothing. The king doesn't even remember his own laws, right? When Esther says there's somebody who decreed to destroy me and my whole people, Achashverosh turns to her and says, who is this? Who could be this? Who tried to do this to you? And then she reminds him of his own law. And then she says, well, could we just repeal that law, which he didn't even remember? He said, well, you can never really repeal the king's laws. So she says, well, maybe you could just issue a second decree that we can defend ourselves. Now, does that sound like the big miracle we've been waiting for? Right? Here's this whole build-up. Mordechai says to her, you've got to go speak to the king, because if you don't speak to the king, safety and salvation will come from somewhere else, but you and your father's house will disappear. You've got to go speak to the king. And she fasts for 3 days, because if the king doesn't welcome her, off with her head. And what does she get out of it after all of this intrigue? 2 parties with Haman, right? Making it look like she'd seduced Haman so he would be hung for trying to have an affair with the queen. All of this, what is this? What's the outcome? What's the tangible take home, the value proposition? The value proposition in the very end of this is she got permission for them to defend themselves. That was it. Permission for them to defend themselves. Really just an opportunity. But that's enough. That's important. Very important. Because when you look at the way in which the Jews come to rescue, it says, Asher natana melech liyudim asher b'chol ir v'ir lihikahel. Lihikahel means to assemble, to come together. The Megillah will use this verb 3 times in association with the rescue of the Jewish people, right? And again, second one is, it tells us that in Shushan the same thing happened. The answer of the Megillah to all of this otherness is, go with it, embrace it. The survival technique against the anti-Semitism is to retain your identity, to be a Mordechai, to be someone who goes back to the king's palace, who goes back to the gates of the palace wearing your sackcloth because your people are in trouble. to be a people who say, you know what, we are a community. And even though they say that we are dispersed and we are all separate, we're all going to be put together. And the way in which we celebrate Purim reinforces all of that. We come together, we retell the story, we send food to interconnect our communities, we have feasts to gather our communities around. And so far I got 3 out of the 4 mitzvot of Purim. The 4th one is giving gifts to the poor, supporting your own. And you have to give them to Jewish poor. So again, the 4 mitzvot, hearing the Megillah, gifts of food, having a feast, and giving to the poor are all elements of this. But maybe the most interesting thing is, Purim is the only holiday on the Jewish calendar that is by design celebrated on 2 separate dates. If you're in a walled city like Shushan, you celebrate on the 15th. All other cities on the 14th. It's kind of like saying, yes, you guys are going to be separated. You're going to be in this city, that city, but you need to feel the embrace. You need to feel the togetherness, the identity, the group setting. You may be a pocket of oil in the sea of water, but if you stick together with the other bits of olive oil, you're going to be just fine. But you can't make yourself into try to make yourself into a water. You are an oil, and it's part about being together. So the Megillah comes and answers this issue of anti-Semitism, of the amorphous nature of the Jew, by saying, they may not understand us, but that's fine. We have to understand us. We have to become who we are. We have to ensure our identity. Our Esthers have to be Hadassahs. Our Mordechais have to stay clothed in their Jewish clothes. That has to be our rescue in all of this, is that we embrace our identity. Then the Jews communicate with themselves. They preserve it in their language. This is if you will, the recovery is all centered around this one Hebrew word, right? That Hebrew word is nikahalu, right? To assemble. And I think that in a way that remains true today. You know, the security officials will tell you in this day and age, do not, you ask them, should Shara Tzedek, not fly an Israeli flag outside? And they say to you, what are you talking about? You are who you are. You're not going to disguise yourselves as a bowling alley, right? You guys are a synagogue. Embrace who you are. And I think by doing so openly, we may, the idea that we can answer the anti-Semites is a fruitless task. These guys are not, they don't define us. They are not our answer. We will not wash it away. And every time that we try to wash away more, it caused greater problems, because ultimately, as we tried to become, as we moved our synagogues to have the bimas in the front and to put organs in them and to move Shabbos to Sunday, you know what happened? Anti-Semitism shifted and said, you know what? These guys, it looks like they're culturally similar, but really we still got this problem. So they moved on to a genealogical anti-Semitism. The Megillah goes there immediately, right? Mordechai does not bow down to Haman. He is a 5th column, and immediately the jump is Lashmig laharog lahabed. I'm going to kill all Jews, taf v'nashim, suckling and women, young and old, all in one day. Right? It's that enormous non-complementary leap. But when we adopt our identity, we're at least known as who we are, and we have a chance of surviving. And one of the interesting things about the Megillah is the Megillah sits on that edge. It is the first story of the Jew in the diaspora. It is the first story of the Jews who speak Persian. It is the first story of the Jews with Persian names. It is the first story of the Jews in high office in a foreign land. And that what we sit on is there are 2 edges to that sword. One edge of the sword is Haman's edge, the anti-Semitism, and the other edge of that sword is the assimilation edge, right? And so the rabbis like to emphasize the assimilation edge with the prostitutes and the non-kosher food and bowing down to the idols. But the text of the Megillah itself almost focuses on the anti-Semitism edge. But the truth of the matter is that the the gathering together, the nikalu, the coming together as one at the end of the Megillah, it solves both problems. And I think that is, to me, I was really shocked when I did the research for this. I started reading more about anti-Semitism and how neatly and how similarly it maps onto the story of the Megillah. To me, was really surprising, and I hope that this has enlightened the pages of the Megillah for you. So at this point, I'll